All right. It has been a long time coming, like 3 weeks late for this June forecast. But as some of you may know, my laptop went out on me at the end of May. Um, and I started a GoFundMe campaign to get money to get a new laptop. And that took about a week or two to happen. And I have my laptop now, and so now I can do the June forecast, which I know many of you have been waiting for. But I feel like the timing is really perfect because the last 2 weeks of June are really where it's at. And it's the part of the year that's ushering us into what I feel like is the major themes and intensity of 2018. And so once we really get to the last week of June into July, it's really on and popping for the rest of the year. I don't really believe that there is any downtime. So I hope that you have been enjoying the Taurus energy as much as possible, even though it's been really heavy, because as we get to the sun in Gemini and all of the things that are happening towards the end of the month in June, I think that we all may be reaching back towards the respite that we did or did not get during the last couple of weeks. I have several notes here. Before I get into the forecast, I do want to talk about a couple of things. If you don't follow me on Twitter, you are missing out. I love Twitter as a platform because it is one that is in sync with time. And I feel like that is the nature of astrology. Astrology is the study of time and the significance of a moment and what is the promise held within that moment for our individual lives, for our collective fate, and for events or endeavors that are undertaken. So to really be able to be in sync with time, I think is important to talking about astrology. So on my Twitter account, which is at People's Oracle, I do weekly forecast threads where I take what I talk about in the monthly forecast and contextualize it within larger cycles and themes. And I give more in depth interpretations rather than an overview, which is what I do in the monthly forecast. And I'm always talking about current events, and that's where I post most of my political predictions. I'm working on transferring them to my blog. So, right now, if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see me upping a thread asking for your suggestions of 2018 midterm election races that I should make predictions for. And I will be putting those on my blog incrementally. So even if you don't see the thread, you can add me and say, hey, Dana, can you make a prediction for this race? The only caveat is that if I do not have a birth date for the candidate, I really cannot make a prediction. A birth date is required because all of the tools I use are predicated on the birthday. Next on my list is to talk about the Aries ingress. Pinned to my profile on Twitter right now is a thread of predictions I made for the United States for 2018 using a special chart called the Aries ingress, which is a chart cast for the moment the sun enters the sign Aries. And the location is set for the capital of the country for which one would like to make a forecast. So that chart was cast for like April 13th or 14th, after sunset sometime earlier this year. And I made a series of predictions. Two big predictions that I made that are coming to pass now were that the general focus of this country, or at least of the citizens, would be on children. And we have seen in really a dark kind of way what that has meant with regard to the prison camps that immigrant children are being forced to live in when they're separated from their parents. We've seen children take the helm of the movements for legislation regarding guns. And then the other major prediction I made was about the economy for 2018 and how we would be in a self-protective stance and the detriment and debility that that would have for the United States economy regarding banking and finance as well as trade. So if you want to know more about the predictions that I've made for the US for 2018, you should go to Twitter and you should go to my profile, which is at People's Oracle, and there is a thread of tweets pinned to the top of my profile. I am transferring that to my blog too so that it will be easier to read and find, and I'll be upping a link to that blog post as soon as it's posted. Finally, before I get into the forecast, the last thing I want to talk about is that today is Donald Trump's birthday. And last year I made some predictions for his birthday. One specific prediction that I made was that he would have issues with women and that infidelity would be made public. And that is exactly what happened and was a major part of his year as far as, as well as some other things. So this year we are going to have some fun conversations about what to expect in his for his life from his birthday 2018 until 2019. And let me tell you, yeah, it's going to be getting busy. So you should follow me on Twitter because you're missing out if you don't. And even if you don't check Twitter every day, just go to my profile because the goods are there. I also post a tarot card every day, which has really been awesome as far as creating a community around collective experiences and lessons that we are all dealing with at the same time, just on a personal, spiritual, emotional level. So let's get into the June forecast. Let's talk about the big picture overview. And then I'm going to do a minor recap of the first few weeks that we have already been through. Then I'm going to go deep into the last 2 weeks, which is where the meat is, okay? So you don't want to miss this. This will be available for streaming in the future, so even if you have to leave, the video will still be here. But let's get started. When we talk about major themes of June, there are so many. And part of the challenge of June, I think, for us collectively and personally, is that a lot of things are happening in the background. And I think that using some symbolism from Chinese astrology and how that has manifested for the world, in Chinese astrology, we're in a Yang Earth Dog year where fire is in storage in the dog, which is very akin to a volcano, right? Fire is in storage in a volcano, waiting for the proper time or its circumstances to erupt. And that is the best symbolism for this year. That we are, especially in June leading into July, there is fire in storage. There's disruption, possibly violence. There's conflict and combat just waiting to erupt and waiting to bring major change, waiting to reveal, provide revelation for us. And as we get into the last week of June, all the way through July, these rumblings and the earthquakes and prodromal symptoms of an impending eruption are getting intense. And so that has to do with Mars, which is grinding down slowly because it's going to station direct at 15 degrees sidereal Capricorn the last week of June. And I didn't write down those dates like I promised to, so now I got to pull up my phone. Hold on. The last week of June, which is going to be the 25th, I believe, the 26th of June, Mars is going to station retrograde. There are two stories, sign pairs of eclipses that are gearing up for us. Those are eclipses in Gemini and Sagittarius, which is new, and the ongoing eclipses in Cancer and Capricorn. That is the second time that you've heard me mention the sign Capricorn. So that means that sign is important wherever it falls in your chart, and the astro events that are happening in that sign are very, very, very important. So we're going to be talking about that today. I do have a video specifically on Mars and Capricorn with horoscopes for each sidereal sign, so you can go to my profile and find that video if you want something more in-depth for that. But I'm definitely going to be talking about the relevant events that are happening within the time frame allotted to this forecast. Let's see what else is happening. Saturn is in Sagittarius. It's retrograde, which I wouldn't make it too big of a deal about. The important thing is that because we're in June heading into July, that means that planets are transiting through Gemini. So that means that the Sun, Mercury, and Venus are all taking turns opposing Saturn in Sagittarius from Gemini. So we're going to talk about that. We've just had a second new moon in Taurus. The first one was May 15th at 0 degrees, and we had one yesterday or the day before yesterday at 0 degrees Taurus. I think that is it for the overview. Let's get into what has been happening this month. Um, the first few weeks, honestly, are relatively quiet in the sense that there's more happening beneath the surface. There is more building and, excuse me, in preparation than there is actual events manifesting. So we started off the month here, let's see, maybe June 5th. Mercury and the Sun conjoined in Taurus. I went live, excuse me, excuse me. I went live yesterday on Periscope talking a bit about the heaviness of planets in Taurus trine planets in Capricorn. And I'll take a little bit of time to talk about why that is, because that has really been a fundamental underlying theme of the beginning of June, is that the Sun and Mercury, and I think, yeah, the Sun and Mercury and the Moon all trine by sign to Mars and Capricorn. What I was talking about with regard to trines is that trines are not benign and trines are not inherently positive. It's very important to release the necessity for black and white, good and bad connotations uh, towards astrological concepts, because life is just not that way. A lot of it has to do with our perception. A lot of it has to do with our own personal experiences and the stories that we measure our experiences against as far as how we interpret our own experiences. But a trine just means support. And the question is, what is being supported, right? Support can be positive. Support can be confining, like a cast, right? There's pain in there. A bone has been broken, and the support is helping the healing process, but there's going to be pain, right? So it's not really black and white in that regard. Support also means that if I have, let's say, Mars in Aries in the first house with, let's say, the moon in Leo in the fifth house, and I'm in a daytime chart, oh, come on. The support of the moon to Mars can mean that I have these really self destructive tendencies of picking fights with people. And I don't know how to choose my battles. And I'm combative. And I'm not a very likable person. And I may experience loneliness because I am always feeling like everyone is attacking me. I don't consider other feelings. So culturally, that support is exacerbating a destructive tendency in someone's personality and temperament. So when we talk about the Sun, Mercury taking turns, and the Moon taking turns, trining Mars and Capricorn, and just the sign-based aspect that has dominated the beginning of June, the first 2.5 weeks, we're talking about the kind of support that Mars and Capricorn gets. Mars and Capricorns has been heavily sober. Sober in the sense that one's delusions dissipate, the inability to have hope, feeling feeling resigned to accepting circumstances that you're in and feeling powerless to fate, but also feeling like you can develop discipline in an area of your life. So the more malignant significations of Mars in Capricorn being trined by planets in Taurus is that we have this acceptance of the status quo, the not wanting to rock the boat, all of these Taurus things of, seeking comfort and convenience, wanting to endeavor in undertaking with the least amount of effort for the most return. Again, so this idea of a resignation, of accepting, and that can lead to feelings of depression, of powerlessness, that I care so much what people think that I don't want to rock the boat. That has so many different applications, right? Sometimes that means that you temper your own predilection towards being combative or impulsive, but it also can mean that tendency towards depression uh, get exacerbated because there's this lack of will to fight or resist, right? So we've seen that collectively. We've seen that happening. We've talked about it on the time. I mean, we've talked about depression and mental health so much in social media. I think that this trine has really been indicative of that. There's no Jupiter and Venus involved here. So there is no expansion and there's no air here, right? When we're talking about air, there's this sense of tunnel vision that there is one way to see things, and that's the way things are. You know, you have to be sober, you have to be practical, but air signs are what allow us to see beyond. It allows us to separate ourselves from our experiences. They allow us to envision something beyond the way things currently are. We can get detached. We can get some distance and perspective. And that's really what we've lacked, because there have not been any trines to Jupiter and Libra, which really would be indicative of having opportunities to see beyond what is. All right. That theme changes in a big way as we move towards the last couple of weeks of June. And that is because the sun is entering Gemini. Venus has already left Gemini. Mercury is in Gemini now. And Gemini is, my word for that sign right now is that it ain't that deep, right? Gemini takes things at face value. It's like, oh, that's really interesting. Let's try this over here. There's no emotional investment. And there's really no intellectual investment beyond the novelty of something. Gemini is on alert for new information and stimuli. And so it doesn't really have time to get bogged down with the heaviness of reality, right? Because of Mercury's nature of being changeable, it can adapt based on new information. Whereas a fixed Taurus, nope, this is the way that it is. This is the way that we agreed that it should be. And so that's what it's going to be. And don't ask me to see or envision something beyond that. So with all of that Gemini happening, which Venus is already out of Gemini, but Mercury's in Gemini and the sun will enter Gemini tomorrow, which is June 15th. At the same time, Mercury is going to be opposing Saturn. So there's a couple things happening with Gemini transits. One, we're getting preludes to the series of eclipses that are happening in our Gemini and Sagittarius house. The first eclipse is July 12th in Gemini. There's the first eclipse in that sign pair. And then planets are taking turns opposing Saturn in Sagittarius. So Mercury is going to oppose Saturn in Sagittarius on the 15th, and the sun is going to oppose Saturn in Sagittarius on the 27th. And then on the 28th, there is a full moon. This is actually happening like overnight. No, I lied. That's later in the day on the 28th. But on the 28th, there's a full moon in Sagittarius. So these three things are all connected. Why? Because on Friday, June 15th, Mercury and Saturn will be in opposition at 11 degrees Sagittarius. On Wednesday, June 27th, the sun and Saturn will be in opposition at 11 degrees Sagittarius. On June 28th, the moon will conjoin Saturn in Sagittarius while simultaneously opposing the sun, which means a full moon, and that's at 12 degrees Sagittarius. So this is a really hot part of our charts. This is a great time to understand the stories that are happening in our Gemini and Sagittarius houses. And this is one of those things where you will want to look back at this time period later on as we get deeper into the Saturn and Sagittarius, the Gemini and Sagittarius eclipses that are starting in July and pick up in January. There's another one, and then of course next summer. All right, let's see, what else do we have here? Let's talk about some specifics of things that are happening. Okay, let's talk about Gemini and Sagittarius and the oppositions between those signs. Saturn in Sagittarius has been about first since June 27th, 2017. It entered Sagittarius for the first time. It left in, did I say June? I'm sorry, January 27th, 2017. Saturn entered Sagittarius for the first time, and it left Sagittarius to go back into Scorpio in June of 2017. And then it re-entered Sagittarius to stay on October 27th. 2017. The major theme of that transit has been, how do I make my life and this world a living testimony of what I say I believe? And when we talk about beliefs, we're talking about religious convictions, moral convictions, and political convictions. We're talking about who gets to determine what's true, what's the moral, religious, political authority for us, and how do we parse the truth, right? Saturn is always reminding us of limitations in our time, energy, and resources. And so we have to be mindful of how we're investing our time, energy, and resources with awareness of those limitations. However, Saturn in Sagittarius is under the command of Jupiter. So that means that all Saturn things, tasks, and agendas are answering to the agenda and tasks of Jupiter, right? So we are investing our time and energy within the context of what we believe is possible. So we are examining our own stories, our own ways of interpreting experiences that we have. We're examining what we have accepted as truth and how that is informing our ability to be competent adults in our lives. We are, for those of you who are having your Saturn and Sagittarius return, that means you're about 28, 29, or just turning 30. The role of religion in your upbringing, the role of spirituality and morality in your upbringing, the role of having personal conviction and beliefs, right? This is your come to Jesus moment for really figuring out, what do you believe? Not necessarily what have you been taught, even though that may be congruent with what you actually believe. But for many of you, you've got Jupiter in Sidereal Pisces, you've got Jupiter in Gemini, right? These are in hard relationships with Saturn and Sagittarius. And so there's this sense of needing to explore, needing to acquire new information to learn and allow that to inform your own sets of political and moral convictions, that you are open to new ideas, that you're not necessarily reliant upon traditional institutionalized religions as a means to informing your own convictions. These are conversations that we are having collectively. Okay, so as planets in Gemini beginning, well, Venus already did that last month. What was the date of that? Venus opposed Saturn in Sagittarius on May 25th. But Mercury is going to oppose Saturn and Sagittarius from Gemini on Friday, June 15th. And Mercury is one of these planets that really has to do with our day-to-day functioning, the work that we're doing with our hands, the tasks that we have, buying and selling things, communication and correspondence, and the tools that we use to get tasks completed. Mercury's at home in Gemini. So Mercury is flexible, Mercury is adaptable, Mercury is able to move freely, except for the opposition to Saturn, which is reminding us that there are so many great ideas, there are so many tasks to be completed, there are so many new things and opportunities that are popping up, but Saturn is like, you cannot do them all. You do not have the time to entertain every idea, every opportunity, every project, every task, every problem that needs to be solved. And so you need to figure out what is the underlying principle that informs your choice of where you will get things done. Right? There is something that's more important. There's something that, or more than one thing, that aligns with your convictions. There is something that has more meaning to you and is more important. And so Mercury opposed Saturn in Sagittarius is asking us to be mindful of those things. The Sun is going to oppose Saturn in Sagittarius the last week of June. I'll talk about that a little bit when we get to it, but similar themes are in mind, right? About Gemini's adaptability and easily stimulated and focused, easily shifting, because that's necessary for Mercury, okay? Mercury is... Oh, let's back up. Let's go to next week. Okay, next week is really interesting because there's one major event happening, which is Venus opposing Mars in Capricorn. This is the first planet to do that. So again, we see a theme here with these planets moving slowly, like Saturn, like Jupiter, and now Mars, because Mars is going to go retrograde. Every planet is going to take turns making an aspect to Mars. So as planets move into Cancer, which Venus was the first to do, Uh, all of the planets are going to have an opportunity to oppose Mars in Capricorn, and coincidentally, that's going to happen as Mars is stationary retrograde. So moving really, 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 really slow. I'm going to talk about what that means because someone asked me, is it a bad idea to move during Mars in retrograde? Someone asked me that on Twitter. And I think that question is rooting in a misunderstanding of what a retrograde is. So I'm going to clear up some of that confusion when I talk about Mars stationary retrograde the last week of June. But for now, we're talking about Venus opposing Mars. That is happening on June 21st at 17 degrees. That's impossible. I have here 17 degrees Cancer Capricorn. The reason why that's impossible is because Mars stations retrograde at 15 degrees. So I'm assuming that that's at 14 degrees. Let me check. Give me a second. I'm looking at my ephemeris here to see where that opposition is going to occur. So let's see. Okay, this is at 14 degrees. Venus and Mars will oppose each other at 14 degrees. So let's talk about Cancer. Let's talk about Capricorn. Let's talk about that opposition, right? We've talked about Gemini and Sagittarius. And those themes that I've identified and outlined for the Mercury and Saturn opposition are really important to understand for the eclipses that are coming. So just keep that in mind. And as we talk about Venus and Cancer opposed Mars and Capricorn, we are talking about, what is implied is the larger theme of the eclipses in those signs. Okay, Cancer and Capricorn. This is the axis of Cancer. Of a moon-ruled sign, the moon-ruled sign, and Saturn-ruled sign. Oppositions in the planets that rule each sign have a special relationship with each other. The moon is the body and Saturn is the limits of the body. The moon is life and birth and growth, gestation, conception, and Saturn is death, endings, darkness, right? These two things are not opposites. They are one and the same. When I see clients who have this opposition in their birth chart, I always talk about how the first Saturn experience we have is the process of being born. Why? Because prior to birth, the body of the mother and the baby is one organism. Baby's kind of like a parasite, to be honest. But there's a process that happens by which the baby becomes its own entity, right? The baby develops literal physical boundaries around itself because now it has its own body. It has its own bones, its own muscles, hair, fingernails that now are growing and functioning in the outside world. So we need these two things. We need the moon and Cancer side, which is this process of gestation. When a baby is in the womb, there is no delay between hunger and being fed. Between thirst and being quenched, between anything, right? Because everything is kind of on autopilot. The baby doesn't have a Mars yet because it does not have any autonomy. It does not have its own moon yet, so it does not have a means by which it will articulate its needs and get them met. Right? Everything is dependent on the mother's body. The mother's body is the body for both of them. The mother's food, the mother's physical energy, all of those things are for the baby. This is Cancer. So there's a symbiotic lack of delay between a need and it being fulfilled. There's also this sense that there is a cycle of needs, of sleeping and waking. We see this very clearly in the relationship between a mother and a nursing baby. They call this the fourth trimester, the first 6 months after the baby is born, because the baby is adjusting to life outside of the womb, and there's still this symbiotic relationship between the mother and the baby. The mother's breast is producing milk in the time, in the quantities, in the biological makeup, just specifically for the baby. So there's still this symbiotic relationship between the mother and the baby where the baby feeds and nurses and the mother's body adjusts based on that time frame. The mother may kiss the baby and ingest bacteria on the baby, and that will change the mother's milk content. The baby is feeding more frequently, so the fat content goes down. The baby is feeding more frequently, the fat content of the milk goes up. This is Cancer, right? Do you see the responsiveness? That's one of the words that I used when I was dispelling myths around Cancer, the sign Cancer. Cancer is responsive. That is the most highest ideal of how Cancer manifests. There is a responsiveness of being tuned in awareness. So when we talk about Capricorn, then we are talking about the limits of the body, right? We are talking about the fact that there really are limits in our resources, our time, and our energy. And Capricorn, being ruled by Saturn, talks about economy. How do we make the best use of our time, our energy, and our resources with awareness to these inherent limitations, meaning that we're not going to live forever. There are only 24 hours in a day. Some of those we're going to be sleeping. We have to eat, we have to rest, we have to play. So how much can you allot to actually working? There are a variety of needs of the physical body, Cancer. There are a variety of emotional needs, some of which we cannot anticipate ahead of time, and that we have to be responsive to in the moment, or we set aside a time later to deal with. This is the essence of the Cancer Capricorn axis. So when we're talking collectively about what that means for us as a nation or as a citizenry or a group of people living together, the moon is the body. We say this, the body of people, right? All of these organisms, all of these individuals, kind of like cells in a liver, right, that have to learn how to function and work together, and they move en masse and they go through these moods en masse. That's really what the Aries ingress is talking about when we look at the moon and the Aries ingress, which I mentioned at the beginning of this video. So when we talk about these Cancer Capricorn eclipses and all of the planets that come along and highlight this opposition, beginning with Venus in Cancer and Mars in Cancer on June 21st, what we're talking about is how can we respond to the needs of the body as they arise? How can we be responsive to the body of people and the needs that collectively arise for us? At the same time, there are longer term plans, goals, needs that must be taken into consideration. If we use up everything that we have responding to now, what are we going to use for later? In that same vein, the limitations of Capricorn is that we cannot always anticipate with logic what is going to happen and how things are going to pan out. So we plan, but we also, Cancer, leave room for responsiveness. Where is this happening in your life? Where are you dealing with needing to be responsive to your own needs as they arise? And also setting long-term goals and honoring your own limitations, right? When we talk about a Venus-Mars opposition, which is happening on the 21st of June, Venus is our relationships. Venus is consideration of others. It is consensus, unifying and coming together. And Mars is division, severance, separation, autonomy, boundaries, self-protection, and self-preservation. Okay, so we have one entity that's bringing things together, one that's separating and dissipating. This is Venus and Mars. They're the perfect pair. We need them both, right? So we're talking about relationships between men and women. We're talking about we need to work together with other people. We need to consider others. If we are always in a martial state, there's always war, violence, and lack of cooperation, disruption, right? We are always in a stress mode, always in fight or flight, always on alert for attack, always on alert for offense, always taking everything personally and needing to shut down so that we can respond to a threat. However, the balance here is that sometimes we need to preserve our own autonomy for the sake of self-preservation. So how are you in your life finding the balance between your need for others, to belong, to be liked, to be loved, and your need for autonomy and freedom? The Venus-Mars opposition is not inherently negative and it's not inherently positive. What it means is that you cannot go full out in one direction and forsake the other, right? Let us move on. Let us talk about now Mercury in Cancer. This will be brief because I've already talked about Cancer. But Mercury in Cancer, that happens next week. or not next week, the last week of June. Remember, I told y'all everything is happening the last week of June. That is on June 25th. Mercury enters Cancer. This is important. This is important. This is important. If you have the People's Oracle 2018 Sidereal Astrology Guide, I want you to go back to January. January 31st, there was a lunar eclipse at 17 degrees Capricorn. If you see the notes there, you'll notice that I told you to take note and come back and look at that when we get to July and August. Why? Mercury entering Cancer means it's time for another Mercury retrograde. Yes, I know. There's 3 or 4 of them a year. You got to deal with it. Blah, blah, blah. But Mercury is going to station direct at the degree of the January 31st lunar eclipse in Cancer. What was going on in your Cancer house, what was happening for you, and even if you don't know the specifics of what was going on for you, you can look back at that day and the days surrounding that, so the week of that eclipse, and what were major themes that are happening in your life at that time. Mercury in Cancer joins Venus in answering to the moon. So the moon collectively, as I said before, represents the body. So there is this collective tribal sense of cohesion among us, but also because of Mars, a collective sense of conflict between tribes arising, okay? And tribe, I mean that in the loose sense, not in like native tribes or indigenous tribes. I mean tribal as in the people we identify with regard to our life and our upbringing and our culture kind of being similar, okay? So Mercury enters Cancer. Mercury will not enter its retrograde shadow until the first week of July. So we'll get to that when that comes. The same day that Mercury enters Cancer on June 25th, Venus in Cancer is squaring Jupiter in Libra. Venus is leading the charge here. I've talked about that on Twitter. I think I've talked about that in another video, but I want to talk about that briefly here. Venus is leading the charge. Venus is moving faster or ahead in the zodiac, not necessarily faster, but it's ahead in the zodiac of all of the other planets. So Venus is the first one to trigger eclipse degrees. Venus is the first one to trigger retrograde station and direct station degrees. Venus is the first planet to enter a new sign ahead of all of the other planets. So Venus was the first planet to enter Cancer on June 8th, and it will be the first planet to square Jupiter from Libra and the first planet to oppose Mars from Cancer. I'm sorry, to square Jupiter from Cancer and to oppose Mars from Cancer. Okay, so along with the Jupiter in Libra, Jupiter answering to Libra, and Jupiter is our trendsetter each year. When Jupiter changes signs, the collective conversation and lens through which we interpret collective and individual events changes. So when Jupiter has been in Libra since September 11th, it really makes it a huge deal that Venus is moving so fast ahead of all of the planets, because every time Venus changes signs, the nuance of how we're experiencing Jupiter in Libra changes. Remember, Jupiter in Libra since September 11th, 2017 has meant justice for and by women, fairness and equality. It has highlighted judges, attorneys, any administrators of the law, and the rules by which they work, the consensus that we have around certain things. These are all things that are up for debate. We've talked about unions, we've talked about voting rights. All of those things have been really very important with Jupiter and Libra. So as Venus is so fast ahead of all of the other planets entering signs first, Venus is going to be the first to square Jupiter from Libra. Now, if we go back to January and February, planets were squaring Jupiter in Libra from Capricorn, and then we fast forward to planets opposing Jupiter in Libra from Aries in April and May. Now they're all squaring. So the Jupiter in Libra story is made manifest and articulated by the slow or faster moving planets that make cyclical aspects with it. So Venus is important because Jupiter is answering to Venus. So it tells us about what kind of stories we're hearing around women, what kind of stories we are talking about with regard to Jupiter and Libra. Right now, with Jupiter in Cancer, Venus in Cancer, commanding over Jupiter and Libra, this idea of Cancer and the body and nurturing. We've talked about children. We've talked a lot about these children who are being separated from their parents. We've talked about families. We've talked about the injustice of the immigration process. Justice, that's our word here. All right. So when Venus in Cancer squares Jupiter in Libra on June 25th, we see the story building up now. There may be a major lawsuit filed because of these children and advocating for these children. There may be some other major legal news, policy change with regard to that situation. A thought just popped in my head and I wanted to say it and I forgot what it was. Can't remember now. Oh well, that means it's time for me to move on. Let us talk about Mars retrograde. That is the next day. So the 25th, Mercury enters Cancer and Venus squares Jupiter. June 26th, Mars enters Capricorn. I said that wrong. Mars stations retrograde at 15 degrees sidereal Capricorn. All right, people. This is one of those major events that I've been talking about forever. You would think I'd be tired of it, but I love astrology. I never get tired of talking about astrology. Mars and Capricorn, let's sum it up. Sobriety, transactional. Soberly assess the resources available to you so you can use them economically. Subdue your will to the limitations that you are soberly aware of. And transactional. You can't get something for nothing. You get out what you put in. And if you don't put anything in, you'll get nothing out. And if you put more in than you should, your fault, right? So there's this sense of being very, very, very mindful of how we invest our time, energy, and resources. Challenge. What's the challenge for Mars and Capricorn, Jupiter and Libra? Why? Jupiter and Libra is like, there's a little bit more nuance here, right? This is not just I invest and I get my return. There's some other things at play here. There are some other rules, some other factors that are affecting my ability to be economical and to get a return on my investment. What are those things? Is it fair? Is it just? Is it righteous? Right? Those are things that can determine whether or not this practical, kind of logical, methodical, transactional nature of investing energy gives us the return that we want. Jupiter in Libra is saying to us, there are some things that are not fair. Don't tell me that if I just work hard, then I am going to make money to save. Labor laws, the minimum wage, it's not fair, right? This is why people are unionizing, because they want to get a fair return on their investment. They go to work, they spend this time, they deserve rights. They deserve health care, they deserve a higher minimum wage, right? These are all themes that are really getting big this summer, okay? Mars stationing retrograde in Capricorn. Let's talk about retrograde. Let's clear this up once and for all. Retrograde means, and I want to read my notes here because I was very specific. When a planet is retrograde, what it is doing, it is in a change from how it normally moves and functions. Every planet has an average speed, an average fast speed, slow speed, and kind of a median in between. When a planet is moving fast, it's going, Mars is going like 3/4 of a degree a day. It takes about 6 weeks for it to move through a sign when it's moving at its top speed, right? But when a planet stations retrograde, it appears to stop and begin to move backwards through the zodiac. So now this energy is emphasized, meaning that when we look at the night sky with no light pollution, where this planet is not shifting in relationship to the other planets. It's kind of like this pole now. So for example, as we're watching planets in Cancer square Mars and Capricorn, Mars is like sitting at 15 degrees and all of the planets are moving around it rather than them moving together and then the other faster planet catches up, right? Moving together. But instead, it's like this, right? Planets in Cancer are moving faster and kind of pivoting in relationship. So this thing is happening in our Capricorn house, which is Mars in Capricorn, and Venus, the Sun, Mercury are all like, I got something to talk about. Capricorn. I know you're trying to be all sober. I know you got these long-term plans. I know you're trying to be economical and make sure we got some for later. But we got some stuff we need to deal with right now. Right? What are the things you need to deal with right now? How can you become more responsive to your own body and needs and contextualize that within the larger frame of what is available to you? So, when Mars stations retrograde, Mars themes are emphasized, magnified in our consciousness, in the news, in our lives. It's saying, look at me, you see me, you cannot ignore me. Mars in Capricorn stationing retrograde on the 25th. So, 26th, sorry. Let's look at the ephemeris here. Mars is going to cross into the 15th degree of Capricorn on Friday, June 22nd, and it is going to remain in the 15th degree of Capricorn until Sunday, July 1st. So that's a good 10 days, that Mars is going to be at 15 degrees. But if we look at a little bit bigger, we'll see that Mars enters 14 degrees Capricorn yesterday and stays in 14 degrees Capricorn until, July 11th, July 10th. So that's a month where Mars is barely moving a degree. Again, this is saying pay attention to Mars. Mars is not going to allow you to ignore it any longer, okay? I want you to go to my YouTube channel after this is over, after you finish watching this, and watch the video on Mars and Capricorn. Or you could just go to my blog, because there's a blog post there where I've aggregated some horoscopes that I wrote on Twitter back in June or January, and then the link to the video is there too. Either way, watch the video on Mars and Capricorn. You want your pen, paper, notebook, whatever, and you want to take notes. You want to have your own sidereal birth chart. Again, you can find instructions for how to get that on thepeoplesoracle.com, and you want to know what's happening. Mars has not ever been in Capricorn this long for most of our lifetimes. And I'm talking about the people who generally are reading my blog and following my work, because you guys are under 50. Okay, you're under 48 for the most part. Those of you who are older, you can think back to 1971 and what was happening in your Capricorn house. However, the nodal axis is flipped this time, so it's going to be a little bit different. All of that to say that this is really an unprecedented transit for many of us. We have no reference point for Mars retrograde in Capricorn. 1971, 1939, those were the last times it happened. So unprecedented means we are setting a precedent. There's an opportunity for something new to happen. And I'll have to look in my ephemeris to see when the next time that retrograde in Capricorn is going to happen. I mean, 50 years ago was the last one, and then 50 years before that. So 40 something years before that. So it's a long time. Yeah. I think that this is a really great place to end the video. I've talked about really the major themes. The last week of June, after Mars stations retrograde, we have the full moon, we have the sun opposing Saturn, we have the full moon that is conjunct Saturn. You can go back in this video and rewind if you need a recap of what the Gemini Sagittarius axis is. But know that Mercury, let me say this really quickly. The July eclipse on July 12th in Sagittarius is at 26 degrees Gemini. Venus crossed that degree on June 5th. And Mercury will cross that degree of 26 Gemini on June 23rd, 24th. Okay? So mark those dates. Just see what's happening. Even if you don't know astrology, even if you don't have your birth chart, even if you're just curious and just learning, just write down what happens during those time periods of your life. And then you can use that as a reference point. Okay? Even if it seems mundane, if you got a phone call, if you met someone, if you got in a car, whatever it is, write it down and use that as your own reference point. Astrology is the study of time. You don't need the signs, to be honest. Just know the times. And that's what I'm here to give with you, right? There's a time and season for all things, and I'm telling you what time it is, all right? You guys enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll be back in a week or whatever to give you the July forecast ahead of time now that I've got my laptop. Thank you everyone who donated and who amplified my GoFundMe campaign so I could be back here doing videos with you. And I really appreciate it. I feel very humbled and I feel indebted to you to continue doing this work and be consistent and give you guys my best. If you don't follow me on Twitter, you should, because you're missing out. At People's Oracle. You can find me online at www.thepeoplesoracle.com. I'm on Instagram at People's Oracle as well. I am looking forward to talking to you guys about this astrology in my weekly forecast that I post on Twitter. So join me. Come find me at People's Oracle. You guys have a great day. Bye.